I wanted to bring it back to the American bishops, American scene, I guess. Given that they're not going to be resigning en masse, and they're probably not going to get pelted with fruit, as was at least in large numbers. And from the Vatican, they're probably not going to rule on any sexuality issues in ways that many American Catholics would want them to, whether it involve women priests or birth control, or at least in any time to come. So my question is, what do you think American bishops should do? Maybe to go a little bit deeper into that than maybe you did before, about what they should do about this situation. As far as what, I can't remember which one of you brought it up before, the question of an alliance with the religious right that they felt was happening. I also wanted to add that I used to be a journalist who covered the Catholic Church for a while, and what I recall is that when the bishops issued their voter guides every year, it's true that on matters of sexuality they agreed with with Christian conservatives, whether it be on same-sex marriage or abortion or certainly the birth control with health care, but on virtually everything else, you'd see them more aligned with Democrats on immigration, on war issues, on poverty. So what would you do? What advice would you give to the American bishops? Not that they would listen.
I would give the advice to be less political in general. I think the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has, up until the past 10 or 12 years, conceived of itself almost as like a gentle and perfectly ineffective think tank for a lot of Democratic Party policies, and now it's shifting because the membership of the episcopacy is different than it was 30 years ago, and now it seems very much more aligned with the religious right, and the voice on health care reform and stuff disappeared. So I would urge them to be almost less political as a bloc, and to spend whatever political capital they have very wisely. I don't expect anything on sexuality, but instead of kind of issuing documents as a national conference that no one reads, they should be teaching their priests and their flock in their home diocese the Catholic Church's teachings on not just sexuality, but on the just wage, on the treatment of employees, on war, etc. Be persuasive on that level. I think that's the problem of the ignorance and disconnect of the laity and the average priest is much more serious than, having the page A33 in the New York Times saying, "Oh, the bishop said X, Y, or Z about healthcare mandate."
You said the problem of their disconnect from
their disconnect, and also just the ignorance and unpersuasive. The Catholic faithful and many priests don't find these teachings at all persuasive. Maybe the bishops could work on that instead of just, like I said, issuing kind of bureaucratic ease about, like little position papers. Mm-hmm. It just seems so much smaller than the authority that they should have.
Do you think American Catholics would listen to that on bishops?
No, not necessarily. In every age, it's much easier to go with the spirit of the age or the spirit of your socioeconomic cohort than with the church. So most Catholics all over the world will continue to exist in this tension space between their culture, the empire, whatever you want to call it, and the church itself, I think.
My view is both as a scholar, but in this matter as a European. I've learned a lot in these 5 years that I am in the United States. So one fact is that in this country there is a two-party system, and that has created a two-party church. That is unique. You don't have this anywhere else, because either in China there's one party, or in Germany, in Italy, you have 5, 6, 8, 10 parties. And so for the Catholic Church there is easier not to look partisan. Here it does look partisan, in part because of the structure of the political system, in part because in these last 20 years, more or less, the bishops appointed, especially under John Paul, they have been picked on the basis of their silence or of their obedience to the official teaching of the church on the 2-3 issues that are the usual ones. And so this, what I would do is to make the bishop's statements in these issues, and it is my impression that those statements are read. Maybe not by average Catholics, but by journalists, and then journalists, so they are important statements. To make those statements present what social Catholicism, so the social doctrine of the Catholic Church in its wide spectrum, first. The second, not to give into the temptation of weaponize the Eucharist, to exclude people from the sacraments. For this, because it has happened that politicians have been threatened, but only for the abortion issues, but not for wars issues. Of course, so there's double standard there. So they should present this as a wide spectrum, and they should at least try to give the impression that they are making a reflection on what's happening. So I arrived in this country in August 2008, a few weeks before Wall Street crashed and so on. In these last 5 years, we did not have a single collective statement of the Catholic bishops on what was going on in this country. That is shocking, actually. That is shocking. So you can write a 2-page statement on the moral issue or showing compassion, but do something. At least do something. And last fall, so before the election of last November, the bishops reprinted and reissued the electoral guide of 4 years before, as if nothing had happened. That is frankly shocking. So I think that if it's a think tank, it's a bad think tank, because they should.
Non-thinking tank.
Well, no, they think. I mean, I just know for a fact. I mean, we know that they tried to make a statement and they couldn't reach a consensus, because you had young bishops saying this statement is not neoconservative enough, and the old social Catholic bishops saying, well, this is too neoconservative. And so that statement failed. So they tried last fall, so after 4 years in the recession, and they couldn't. So there are problems that are structural. So a two-party system tends to have the press and voters on one side or the other, and the third position is not there. But there are also issues that can be addressed in a more sensible way, in terms of doing things, of saying things, and of looking that you're doing or saying something. It seems to me that they take for granted sometimes, and that's one big problem, they take for granted that whatever they say, the public will be hostile, will be non-receptive, and so they should, at very close range, because they say, well, they will not listen anyway. I'm not sure that it's so. I tend to think that in the United States, Catholicism, it is polarized, but not as polarized as the New York Times or First Things would like us to believe. I think that there's a middle ground that is there. So that's my impression. I think that and this is one general problem for Catholicism, there are a lot of things that bishops teach, and they are not received, and they are not accepted. That's part of the game. But there are different kinds of non-reception. I mean, Humane Vitae, the teaching on contraception, has been non-received, but it has not been perceived as outrageously reactionary teaching. It has been perceived as idealistic, as old-fashioned, but not a fascist teaching, right? But there are other teachings that sometimes are non-received because they are perceived as outrageously reactionary or partisan. That's different. So Humane Vitae is not a partisan issue. It is anthropologically much more complicated. So I tend to be more sympathetic of teachings who are not received because they are too hard to accept or too idealistic. I'm not sympathetic at all when bishops sometimes they try to stick their finger in the people's eyes. That's unacceptable. It is a political stance which is not acceptable for me as a Catholic. And
okay,
yeah,
all right. Now let me just say that one of the interesting things about this panel and this room, in fact, is that it's majority male, and I perceive Humane Vitae as the first major step in undoing the Second Vatican Council. So that may not be fascist, but it was certainly reactionary. You know, I mean, he actually ignored the panel, the committee that he'd called together.
Absolutely.
You know, and speaking for women, you say, oh, you know, it didn't stick a finger in anybody's eye. Well, I suppose in the sense that you could ignore it if you want. Now, during the Fortnight of Freedom, let me just say, I read somewhere that 97% of Catholic women in the United States who had been sexually active reported that they had sometimes used contraceptives in their life. Interestingly enough, only 66% opposed the bishop's position on Fortnight of Freedom. A friend of mine said, well, I guess some of them repented after menopause. In any case, let me just say, I know people who feel a lot more strongly about that encyclical, that document than you do, and they're almost all female.
It is fair to say that now, in 1968, my impression is that they didn't realize the gap between the Catholic perception of homosexuality and what was really going on. So we can say now, retrospectively, that teaching was out of sync with Penny Singh.
And had been for a long time, let me be clear. I grew up in a white working-class neighborhood in Philadelphia in the 50s, and every Catholic family on the street had 2 kids in the 50s, okay? I'm sure it was a coincidence that they didn't have 13. But do you want to continue?
No, I had a different question, so if you want to.
Well, 2 things. One, I think to address your question about appearing partisan, part of the imbalance is that the popes will not say, like John Paul II and Benedict XVI were very clear about, say, the Iraq War, what they thought of it. But they do not have the confidence, or really the Catholic theology doesn't give them the ability to say that this is an infallible judgment, because they admit that, okay, this is a prudential judgment, this is based on imperfect information that we have, this is our judgment, whereas contraception or abortion or other moral issues, they say, are absolute non-negotiable. But that's compounded by our particular political culture in the United States, where at the elite level of politics and journalism, partisan divide is a cultural divide, right? I mean, that is how people divide themselves in the way they feel about the 2 major parties. They say, you know, and this is putting it very crudely, I hate those Bible-thumping fundamentalists who hate women and gays and et cetera. I'm voting Democratic. I hate those pointy-headed academics, San Franciscan, freak shows. I'm voting Republican. So the cultural issues are so important in creating the identity for the parties that for the Catholic Church to be seen to be on one side of the culture war makes them seem even more partisan I think, than they are even comfortable being seen as. I mean, you see that they want to try to balance it out, but they have such a difficult time doing it.
Well, one more question. You'd mentioned before your feelings about Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul II. Usually people, well, it's rare to hear people who have different opinions about them in the way that you expressed. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. It was articulated earlier that John Paul II's papacy looks like a disaster in many ways. And partly it's the abuse scandals. Now, whether he's culpable for them is obviously incredibly difficult to determine. I mean, the Pope does not move every piece, every bishop, every priest like they're checkers pieces on a board and is responsible for all of them. But at the same time, he was responsible for promoting the cult of Maciel and the Legion of Christ. He was warned about these things and ignored them. Benedict XVI was elected, and within 60 days, Maciel was gone. That's lightning fast in Vatican speak. Benedict also, in 2002, started centralizing the handling of abuse cases in the CDF, and things began to improve, but there was still a lot of sludge to work through. What I think the public perception of these popes was shaped by the fact that John Paul II reigned in a time when the Catholic Church's moral authority was at a higher point. He was also a showman in many ways, charismatic. Benedict XVI was immediately defined as the Panzer Cardinal upon his election, or even before it. There weren't stories about his love of cats and his love of playing the piano or something like that. It was Hitler Youth, against ecumenism. He's the guy cracking down on liberation theology.
Although John Paul II was actually the guy, wasn't he?
Right. I mean, John Paul II is the one who authorized Benedict to do this, or Ratzinger.
Ratzinger was the number two. So, given that Ratzinger is often described as having been the number two under John Paul, to what degree do you? I mean, if you're not pleased, obviously, with John Paul's papacy, how much responsibility do you think that Ratzinger has for that?
Well, the parts that I think Dominus Iesus, the document that was issued by the Catholic Church under John Paul II, written by Joseph Ratzinger, was a very good clarification of the Church's position about other world religions. I think he was theologically competent in a way John Paul II wasn't. But at CDF, he was not in charge of who's getting appointed bishop in a very direct way. He's in charge of, investigating a book written 30 years ago and what does it mean now. So he was a number two, he was an enforcer, but enforcing what? The only real schism of the John Paul II papacy was the traditionalist schism with the Society of St. Pius X. Those were the bishops that were excommunicated. There were other priests that were silenced or urged to be quiet, and there was not follow-up. I mean, Hans Kung still teaches, or still taught.
Not after 1980.
Not as a Catholic.
But he
teaches.
But who pays
The
attention
Mercedes Foundation built a whole university faculty for him, and so that's why he could teach. So
right.
If I can speak to that, I think that these last 35 years, it has been in many respects one pontificate with two men. That's my impression.
Yeah.
We know for sure, because he said that Joseph Ratzinger knew things on the abuses, and he said there was nothing else I could do to stop this, but he knew that. But he stayed in Rome for 25 years before becoming Pope. So it's hard to see him as an outsider. I mean,
right.
Absolutely.
That's my impression. So for the many shortcomings of Pope John Paul II, I think that there's one thing that we should give him credit, that from a Polish Pope, nobody expected that kind of teaching on Jews and Judaism. Nobody expected that. Mm-hmm. That was completely unexpected, and that is the major gift that, and we should remember that especially for Europe and for North America, this is, after John Paul being anti-Semitic, it's impossible. In the Catholic Church, not just legally, but culturally, it's not part of the landscape. So there are many things that
All right, so I want to say two things. One, I wanted to kind of affirm what Michael said about the bishops, which is the bishops need to have more contact with the people in the pews. I mean, who's ever talked to a bishop, for God's sake? Once. I emailed the Bishop of Albany through the web page one time, and he wrote back to me. I almost had a heart attack. And I've been a Catholic for like 50 years when that happened, or 55 years. But I mean, generally speaking, this is not a problem. And then the second thing I wanted to say is, I think that we need to, there's a guy named Gene Burns, who's a historical sociologist, wrote a book, a pretty smart book in 1992 called The Frontiers of Catholicism. And he said that at Vatican II, at Vatican II, the Catholic Church gave up certain teachings of absolute authority that it had held for centuries. For instance, that you had to be Catholic in order to be saved, and that there was no religious freedom. I mean, they started saying people had religious freedom, right? And that institutions, by and large, do not give up absolute power. So that after Vatican II, what the Church did was it shifted its claim to absolute truth and power from doctrine to sexuality and morals. And that's why there's all this uproar now, because they are saying things about the natural law and sexuality with the same degree of absolute certainty that they used to talk about the divinity of Christ, like John Paul II's encyclical, The Gospel of Life. When it came out, I said to my husband, I thought it was the gospel of Jesus Christ. What are we talking about here, you know? And so that's one of the reasons. I mean, I agree that the bishops sometimes issue statements about social issues. Do they enforce them? Was the Leadership Conference of Women Religious attacked for putting too much energy into justice and peace? No, it was because they hadn't said something. Talk about the argument from silence. They hadn't said something about sexuality that the Vatican expected from them, because that's the new divinity of Christ, is abortion and contraception. And you can, I think Burns was brilliant. I think that when you understand that that is what he called the top of the Catholic ideological hierarchy now, all of this stuff falls into shape, which is, yes, they say things about peace and justice, but do they enforce it? Do they, I mean, give me a break. Yes.
I think it goes back to some important theological background, because if you look at the moral theology of the Catholic Church, right, you have a definition of a sin which is intrinsically evil, which is reserved only to sexual sins, but there's no intrinsically evil deed in terms of social justice, all right? So it's not, so I can understand kind of shift or focus, right, that you just explained.
Listen,
based on,
it was as much a sin in the 19th century to believe in the separation of church and state as it was to believe in abortion. So don't give me that. There were political positions that the Catholics simply could not hold.
Sure.
Well, I mean,
I disagree with that a little bit, and I don't think this is the right forum to do so, but I would defend Humanae Vitae and its teaching, and you know, from all comers. I think it's a life-giving teaching. It's a radical teaching that I think can give enormous peace to people. However,
but not very many Catholic women agree with you.
No, right? But I mean, I would say this: the failure to live up to it. Say 90% of women. I'll get into it. If 98% of women, let's say, which is itself an exaggeration because it doesn't actually count so many other people. However, if 98% of people have practiced contraception, 98% of women, how many have broken some other commandment? Does somehow the logic of the Church's teaching on sexuality fall apart because people disobey it? Do the logic of the Ten Commandments fall apart because we fall short of them? I don't think so. As for the intrinsic social sins, I mean, my old catechism lists, you know, the 4 sins that cry out to heaven for vengeance. One of them is oppressing widows and orphans. Another one is defrauding a man of his just working wages. Those, and that's listed on level with other sexual sins and murder itself. So
Are they enforced? That's the question.
Well, nothing.
Have you heard of anybody being denied communion because of?
Exactly. So then you have practical issues like, well, like the sacramental confession. So it appears that it's graver, for an adolescent to masturbate than for another person to oppress the poor. Because in terms of absolution, in terms of sexual sin, which is intrinsically, regardless the circumstances, grave, you cannot get absolution. So I mean,
well, you can get. I mean, you can confess sexual sins in a confessional and receive absolution. And believe me, 98% of people who disobey on contraception, men and women, present themselves for communion all the time without having gone to confession. They are never denied it. I mean, you never see a parish priest practically deny people communion for these things.
You cannot.
What?
You cannot probably.
Right.
Can. If I can say something, this is an issue that is particularly felt in the United States.
Which issue?
Of sex, of sexuality as a cultural marker. So if I can say something as an alien who still has a green card, I mean, we should resist the temptation of equating Catholicism with American Catholicism. Right? So this is a typical American thing that has to do with the two-party system, with the legacy of Calvinism. So there are many things.
Irish Jansenism too.
You know much more than I do about this, but you never hear of these things as things that make you a certain kind of Catholic or another kind of Catholic or a non-Catholic in Europe or in Asia.
See, that's not true, Massimo.
No,
All those
that's
French Catholics were marching in the streets 6 weeks ago over gay marriage.
I'm not
Many
sure
of them-
how many Catholics
Many of
were
them
there,
were not
actually.
Catholics. I mean,
But it is a debate.
Some of the newspapers
that
thought they were.
It is so everywhere in the world Catholics disagree with Humane Vitae, but that doesn't become the first or the sole issue on which they divide themselves. So this is.
So why did the Vatican go after the nuns, particularly with regard to feminism and contraception and abortion?
Because they are an easy target.
Yeah, I know, but I mean, like, if European Catholics are not as concerned with this stuff, I mean, it's a European institution.
In European
isn't it?
Catholicism, there's no organization of women religious that is as important, as visible, and as symbolical as the LCWR. So the LCWR is a target, is a symbol, as the communists in China said. You punish one to set an example for everybody, and so that's that was happened. And so my impression is that now with Pope Francis, he will let things cool a little bit because it cannot overturn policy overnight. But Joseph Ratzinger, as a pope, appointed Cardinal Leveda to do that dirty job, and the SWR was one of them, Catholic theologians in the U.S. So it's easy for me to understand why they picked them,
Okay,
because
that
they
makes
are
sense.
very active. Mm-hmm. They are losing members, and being on the losing side of history makes you an easy target.
right. Right. This was done in 2013, not in 1984, when the situation for the LCWR was very different as far as the way it looked, its strength or its numbers.
No, the whole thing started in 2008.
That's right.
Right.
In a conference in Massachusetts, where one nun from the conservative wing
And Cardinal Rode.
and Cardinal Rode. So it's a thing that is it's one of the typical thing that happened after Pope Benedict. That was one of his, and again, the issue under the issue is Gaudium et Spes. I mean, Pope Benedict hates Gaudium et Spes. He has never quoted Gaudium et Spes as a pope. And the SWR is about
The signs of the times.
the signs of the times, social issues. So it makes perfect sense. I guess that things will calm down a little now.
Yeah, okay.
That's
What were you
my
going to say
impression.
about the LCWR in 84?
No, I was just going to say that Massimo says it's an easy target. It's an easier target in 2013 than it would have been 30 or 40 years ago.
Sure, yes.
Because of its declining membership. It's
Although I got to tell you that the Cardinal Archbishop of Washington flew to Rome and demanded the foundation of conservative women's religious congregations when Mary Daniel Turner published a book about the LCWR like 20 years ago. So they've been in the sights for a long time.
There's also there's a subterranean issue happening where people that come maybe from my perspective, more traditionalist perspective, there's something they talk about, whisper about, in regards to the leadership of bishops, of religious nun groups, etc. They talk about something, they have a very interesting term for it. They call it the biological solution. Have you heard of this?
No, but I get it.
The biological solution is
They're all going to die.
they're all going to die. And, for instance, at my church, I go to one of these, it is a polarized church in a way that makes me sometimes uncomfortable, but it's a traditional church. There are families of 10, 12 kids, and they see themselves as the future, the young, the zealous. They see themselves as countercultural. They don't see themselves as they won't.
On this playing field, Muslims are going to beat us, everybody, all of us.
Well,
so if we put things on that level, I'm not sure if it's a good strategy.
No,
Actually.
on that. But I'm talking about just within the power structure of the church itself.
Yeah.
Is they see themselves as the future, and they talk openly about the biological solution. We'll just wait. Those people that were indoctrinated in that line of thinking are all going away, and we will inherit.
Then you'll have the church.
The Catholic Church is a ruthless institution. It is very ruthless. I mean, once you become 80 years old as a cardinal working in the Vatican, the Swiss guards, they know that you have retired because you are older than 80, and they do not salute you anymore. This is as ruthless the institution is. So, but if they say that, which I don't like if they say that, but they don't consider that there is, before the biological solution, there is the canonical institution, because at 75 every bishop retires. And so canon law has preceded this.
Here's
this
another
thing.
thought about the crisis versus catastrophe binary, which is that I think some Catholics, probably your friends at the church, think that the solution is that we cut back to, they say, Benedict never said this, a smaller, purer church. Like I was at a conference 5 years ago in San Francisco. I was talking to a conservative priest, theologian, who said to me, there are only 5 million real Catholics in the church in the United States. And I said, seems to me like 60 million people is a lot of people to dismiss. But he believed it. So it's not a crisis, it's not a catastrophe. Soon we're going to be rid of all these people that have these secular liberal ideas, and there'll be this very small group of real Catholics.
Well, I'm not actually for pushing people out. I think that would be a mistake. That would be the kind of sectarianism. My big complaint is the lack of ability to invite people in and to be persuasive, to live a life of holiness in any regard whatsoever. I don't necessarily welcome the smaller church. And even sometimes Benedict would talk about how when he was young, he was more rigorous. When he was young, his inclination was to deny baptism to the children of non-practicing Catholics. When he was older, he felt that was too rigorous for him. Most Catholics exist in some liminal space where they are not devout, screeching reactionaries like me, and they're not full-on apostates who want to see the church, écraser l'infamie either. They negotiate their lives as Catholics there has to be room for that. Like I said, it is good that the older style of churches had these pillars where people could, in a sense, be in the church, but still, in a sense, be hidden as well.
Just one thing. We all live in a liminal situation. We all negotiate.
Right.
All of us.
Yes.
Even the Pope. Even saints. Even so,
Yeah, yeah.
we all negotiate.
Absolutely.
So this is
Lillian.
important, I think.
Lillian.
Well, speaking about countercultural, the gospel is countercultural. Okay, Catholic social teaching is countercultural. And according to Cardinal Bernardin of blessed memory, his philosophy of the seamless garment from the womb to the tomb, what do we think about that? Do we remember these things in terms, when we're talking about what the bishops say? I mean, there are certain things, but what do we really believe? How do we act? I'm just remembering a church, we had a conversation, a church that really led us into action and really it was very passionate before and after Vatican II in the area of justice and presence.
It's a mistake, and it's particularly, I agree with Massimo, an American mistake to try to counterpose just the justice issues on one side and life issues on another.
Aren't they all one?
Well, they ought to be. The church's social justice teachings are almost, I think, as radical and as scary as something like Humanae Vitae to the larger culture. I mean, when you read about and especially to American culture, where there is this cult of ambition and success and worldly acquisition that's been divorced even from, any Calvinistic roots it might have had that might have tempered it in some way. To announce, to try something like the English distributists did and say that for the dignity of man, all men and women should have access to productive property of their own rather than just be wage slaves in a market economy. That would be as radical and as controversial as any sexual teaching in American culture if it was announced with any kind of conviction or fury.
But of course the bishops would never say it because they'd have people marching out, the richer people.
Maybe, yeah.
I mean, have you ever heard anybody saying anything? I practically never heard social teaching preached from a pulpit. Maybe 3 times.
My answer is this. So the relationship in Christianity and in Catholicism especially between culture and counterculture is very complicated. Why? Because Catholicism lives in cultures. Italian Catholicism is different from American Catholicism. So, but it is also countercultural. So there are things that, and every culture has difficulties with the gospel. So, or with what we teach of the gospel in terms of social message. What is particularly difficult, in my view, for American Catholicism is that differently from any other Catholicism in the world, American Catholics, until very recently, they had to prove themselves not just good Catholics, but good Americans. Very differently from Italian Catholics. I mean, Italian Catholics are usually poor Catholics, but they have never been seen as foreign, as aliens, as a threat. That was the problem of American Catholics. Until Vatican II, it was very visible. After, it's much less. So my perception as a European Catholic of liberal inclination, I'm disturbed sometimes that I see that the Catholic Church in this country is so focused, is so strong on certain issues, but on other issues that are typical of American culture, like patriotism or militarism, I see, I hear a very shocking silence. Why is that? Because they still need, so at least I hope that they do that because they feel the pressure to look good Americans. But my worst fear is that they don't even realize that, and they have been completely absorbed by American culture.
Yeah, I think that's right.
That's my impression. So, and this is one thing that, so if we go back to Vatican II, every bishop voted in 1965 against the morality of nuclear weapons, except the American bishops. Not everything has changed in these last 50 years. So I see that American Catholicism or the American leadership, I mean, American bishops are very courageous when it comes to life, to abortion. They are not so courageous or worse when it comes not just to wars, I mean, Iraq or this kind of thing, but to the culture of militarism. That is for a European, and I have served in the military, so I have no anti-militaristic views, but as the US society works, there are things on which I feel that American Catholics still are under this shadow of suspicion that makes them sometimes react and look more patriotic than they need to. That's my impression, but I may be wrong. So I'm on a green card, so I cannot make political speeches. So
Yes,
I hope that this is not a political speech.
In thinking about this question of crisis, one thing that's sort of we've been discussing is sort of theology as part of this, and as a crisis of theology, and sort of Brendan, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but in some ways I'm hearing from you that it's going to be the theology that's going to be the pillar that either the church sort of stands on or sort of will collapse without. In thinking about that, though, is there a tension between sort of wanting to have the theology in place, which I think was part of Benedict's project, to make sure that the theology was firm, but also the tension with where theology is being done, both in a university setting, often by lay persons, but also a global theology. So it's now sort of theologies coming out of Africa, coming out of the Far East, coming out of Latin America, and sort of the difficulty in reconciling that as part of this tension. So it sort of turns the attention to sort of often the challenge, it's not by the lapsed Catholics, it's by sort of the good, the thoughtful ones, sort of the theology between sort of these models of theology. And I'm curious what you would say to that, between sort of getting the theology in place versus theologies.
Yeah, it's interesting because theology has often been done just since the Middle Ages, often in a university setting. Before that, by just bishops and priests writing, giving sermons and debating with each other, and then history kind of throws some of them away and keeps some of them. But there's also been this sense where something like the sensus fidelium in the church as a whole is a factor, and the liturgy itself, and I don't just mean the rubrics of the Mass, but all the things that creep up as ornaments around the liturgy, that embody national intuitions and cultures, things that are done before a wedding, after a wedding, but are tied to Catholic liturgy, are often generative of theological ideas and concepts, or clarifying of them. That seems to have largely gone away, or at least been suppressed in a place like America or Europe. And in a place like Latin America, it's been very difficult because theology has been done in a context of constant revolution and counter-revolution, and you just have a theology that is so politicized and burdened by immediate history. I have an uncle who's a priest in Nicaragua, and he remembers all of his fellow priests coming out of the seminary in the 70s, going to Latin America, trying to be part of the revolution, trying to negotiate how these revolutions, how priests should be in these revolutions. Should they abandon the sacraments and the parish altogether and focus solely on political action? Or should they not? Almost all those priests are gone. They're back retired in Europe. And he's there living with the legacy of, we supported Ortega in Nicaragua, and Ortega turns out to be as monstrous or worse than before. From the Vatican's perspective, Latin America is almost nuclear as far as theology. Don't even look at it or touch it right now because it's so enmeshed in the politics of its time. So I think people doing theology in the third world have been handicapped. Their work may be recognized, but it may not be recognized in the breadth of the church for another 50 years or 100 years. I mean, it just seems like it's the immediate history is too hurtful for too many people, or too intense to consider it fairly.
You had a question?
When you all were talking about women religious and birth control, you're sort of dancing around my question, which is sort of an observation that the pews are very heavily filled with women, and not only is the clergy obviously not, but also there are few other positions for women as explicit leaders, both because of the persecution of women religious, but also because of the decline of women religious. And so going back to this question of crisis or catastrophe, is this a solvable problem without reconciling that divergence, that presence, that dominant presence of women among the faithful, and the absence of women among the non-lay leadership, because obviously there are women leaders among the laity, and so the question is it reconcilable, and how might it be reconcilable, or maybe the only reconciliation would be allowing women into leadership.
Let me say two things. I have here a lecture given by Gary Macy at Santa Clara like 5 years ago, and here are some statistics. This isn't to undercut your question, but he says, according to figures gleaned from the National Institute for the Renewal of the Priesthood, women comprise 25% of all diocesan chancellors, 80% of all parish lay ecclesial ministers, 40% of all parish liturgy planners, 65% of all parish music ministers, 88% of all parish religious educators, 50% of all parish RCIA directors, we're not sure what the difference is between that and the previous one, 63% of all participants in lay ecclesial ministry formation programs, and in 2005, lay women made up 64% of all lay ministers, and women religious added another 16%. So it seems to me you could say that undercuts what you're saying in a certain sense, because clearly women are in a lot of positions. But then I was thinking about, Rembert Weekland, the Archbishop in Milwaukee, in his memoir, which was published around the same time, said, the decision not to ordain women was the loss of the future. So what does the decision not to ordain women have to do with the crisis or the catastrophe? That's amplifying your question, I think.
I mean, the decision obviously is not prevented. And the statistics you just cited comport very well with my own anecdotal experience of parish life, that the Catholic Church has men in front, and then most parishes are run by a kind of shadow matriarchy that exists. Mm-hmm. Arguably, that goes back all the way to the Gospels in some ways, is that you have these bumbling, idiotic, rash 12 apostles who mess up everything, and then a group of 70 or so women who are handling the burial of Jesus, the other rituals that are supposed to happen. I don't know if that's something just endemic to Christianity, but itself. I don't know how it's resolved. because again, the most vocal proponents of ordaining women find themselves on the margins of the church right now. And there's a huge amount of women that still operate in the current situation. So I don't know if that tension is going to be felt as strongly in 15 or 20 years as it is now or has been in the past 30 years. I'm not sure. I mean, maybe...
I think that this is the biggest problem. So I don't think that the Catholic Church can ignore this. I mean, in these last 15, 20 years, they have ignored this. From an historical point of view, what we see now, it's also strange, because if we go back, for women of the European aristocracy, entering the convent or the monastery was an act of liberation sometimes. I mean, of having more power, more influence, more access, more. Now, the view of becoming active for a bright woman in the Catholic Church is seen as an act of humiliation, of submission. So this, we have turned completely the perception, if not the real thing. So I think that this is the biggest problem that there is. On one side, one complicating factor is that this issue is particularly felt in the Western world, in Europe and especially in North America, where Catholicism is growing, which is in the southern hemisphere. It is not a big issue. So I was in Indonesia last summer for 2 weeks. I was teaching, and they do things. Women do things. I mean, at Mass, and on Sunday they have 7 masses, and the first Mass is at 5:30 a.m. All filled, people in the parking lot. So women there, they are dressed just like priests, and they give the Eucharist just like priests. So they don't advocate; they do things, which is usually the best way. I
wanted to disagree with you a little bit about the Global South. I thought what you just said for years. I'm an women's ordination activist. I've been working on it for 30 years, 35 years, something. But I'll tell you 2 things. Ngbakmene Orobakar, who's a Jesuit theologian from East Africa, has an ecclesiology of the church in East Africa. And at one point, he begins to discuss the AIDS epidemic in East Africa. And he says, he's no fool, he's a Jesuit, he says, well, it would seem that the question of the ordination of women is settled in the Catholic Church. However, I note that AIDS victims in the Catholic Church in East Africa, the goal of their life is to die with the sacraments. But since priests in East Africa will have nothing to do with AIDS victims, so it's only women who are dealing with them, they die without the sacraments. He says, this seems to me to be a problem. Now, this is an East African saying this. This is not a European. And a second thing is, I was having a conversation with a member of the Grail. I belong to the Grail in Nairobi, and she was doing a master's degree in international relations. And she said to me, not about the ordination of priests, but you'll get the connection. She said to me, the bishops here think they can tell us what to do about our sexuality. Who do they think they are? This was a Kenyan woman, an African woman. Now, she was educated. But my thought is that as women get educated, it's going to be unacceptable in a lot of places, not just... Yeah. I mean, it's here first, but I don't think it isn't going somewhere else.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Yes.
The thought occurs to me that the structural dynamics, contemporary structural dynamics inside the church, would not be able to avail itself of a connection between women and the papacy that we saw with Teresa of Avila or Catherine of Siena. There's no access. I mean, when I listen to those statistics you read, I hesitate to use this term, but I think, well, these are good worker bees suffering from a lot of false consciousness.
Yeah, and probably not being treated very well in some situations.
Yeah,
Some. Some,
This is
not
true.
all.
This is true.
And I would just add that this is somewhat dated in the late 1990s. We did a survey for the Women's Ordination Conference. The majority of women had been trained in Catholic seminaries. They were working in Catholic institutions at that time. They still wanted to be priests, but they were doing what they wanted to do given the limitations. Now many more women are ordained irregularly in different settings, so I think that statistic may have to be looked at again, but it's not necessarily a false consciousness, but in terms of the numbers, it may be.
Some. Let me, I was just going to say something and it's gone. I do not recommend getting older.
I want to say something. Yeah. This situation in these last few years has become worse because I know for a fact that in some theological in some Catholic theological institutions, Catholic colleges, there are young Catholics who refuse to take courses in theology from women professors. They refuse that. So they have transplanted the imago Christi of the priesthood out of the priesthood to teaching theology, which is a thing that lay people can do.
Yeah, of course.
So,
in a
so
sense,
now
they're correct, of course, because women are having a lot of impact through teaching theology. And if you don't want them to have impact, that's something.
Absolutely.
This is, of course, a reversal of the Mary Daly situation where she was fired from Boston College for not having men students. And now we've got students who are refusing to have women professors.
So they don't know who Mary Daly is.
No, I'm sure.
Course.
I remember what I wanted to say. I think it would be interesting to consider whether the ordination of women, at least initially, was not a fundamentally conservative issue. That is to say, imagine if Paul VI in 1976, when he issued Inter Insigniores, had said that women could be ordained. I cannot tell you the number of Catholic women then that I know who would have been grunt parish priests for the rest of their lives. They would have been thrilled to spend their lives baptizing and marrying and burying people. So it's just an interesting, and right now I just read some statistics that 5 years ago, the number of Catholic priests in the previous 40 years in the world had remained almost constant, and the Catholic population had doubled at the same time. Imagine if women had been ordained to minister to those people. It would have maintained the institution in a way that not ordaining them has not done, beyond the shadow of a doubt, to the point where I think I'm against the ordination of women because I think the church needs to be radicalized in a way that I think adding troops, it'd be like, what was the term you used? False consciousness moved to a higher level, maybe. But just think what would have happened if they had. We have this friend, Judy Heffernan, who went to seminary in the 70s. Honest to God, she's a really conservative person, except she was completely radicalized by the Pope's position, Anyhow, yes.
Just a quick comment on your last comment, Massimo, about I take it they were new students refusing to be taught by women, which kind of goes against what you were saying about that horrible phrase, biological solution, that you were suggesting that there's this liberal young new generation.
No, I was suggesting a conservative young generation
going against
waiting
the liberal.
for liberals to die, older liberals.
So
to die.
that supports that, because we've been hearing in our seminar group about how the evangelical movement in America has been getting more liberal without people even really noticing, so attitudes to homosexuality, sexuality in general, women's rights, all of those sorts of social issues have just been changed without any real fight. Like if you do polls amongst the megachurches in the Midwest, you find that the young are not against any of these things. And so, I got that wrong, so the comment has kind of shifted a bit. Are you not seeing that at all in the Catholic position across America?
You're seeing, if you poll Catholics as just Catholics, not discriminating based on age, they're the religious group with the most liberal attitudes on gay marriage, on abortion and other things. when you narrow that to mass-going Catholics or something like that, the numbers change radically. I mean, if you think of it this way, in the United States, the number one religious affiliation is Catholic. The second largest religious affiliation is ex-Catholic. Southern Baptist comes well after that, and kind of a broader evangelical movement. But what I see in the church is a small but very dedicated, hardcore, some of them call them the New Orthodox. They're founding colleges like Christendom College or Franciscan University of Steubenville or St. Thomas Aquinas out in California. Or they're retaking over universities like Notre Dame from a more liberal cohort that preceded them. They seem to have the they seem to be the creative minority right now, the more active revolutionary force, where the old guard seems old and busted. I mean, just to use a freedom.
I guess one question would be, given that the evangelicals, I mean, what I've read about the evangelicals is their kids, like, go to school with gay kids and can't see any reason to demonize them and all. So the question is, what will happen to the children of these people if part of what's going on is you react against the previous generation? I mean, I know that's dismissive, but to some extent, it may be that part of that too also.
It's hard to know. I mean, if they conceive of themselves as a you know, what you may have with the massive evangelicals is they have been tired of being in a subculture or in a cultural ghetto and want to be a part of the mainstream of America. They did not like the politicization of their faith with the religious right. What you're seeing with the hardcore young Catholics is
the opposite movement.
Almost
going
the opposite.
Back to
they want to be in a ghetto, in a sense.
Exactly.
They want to be a creative subculture.
Good luck with that.
No, it's difficult, but at the same time,
no, it's not working. It's not working.
Well, it's not working. And I, in my opening, I said that adopting the faith as a kind of ideology is a dead end. However, adopting the world, translating every single one of the world's priorities into the terms of the faith is also a dead end. So if our position is, if the position people want the Catholic Church to take is to agree with a bunch of rich white people in the United States on all cultural imperatives, that is a disaster for the Catholic Church, whether they be sexual or economic or whatever. So what these young Catholics want to do, they're going into a ghetto. I believe that's wrong, but they do so because they want to speak at the culture. Some of it is feeding their own self-righteousness, you know, whatever. People are complex and motivated by a lot of things.
I'm not sure that the culture will listen if they speak in Latin. That's my impression. So so as a European Catholic, I am disturbed, really, also because I have an almost 2 years old daughter. So I'm growing concerned about my daughter. But some excesses of liberalism, of liberal culture. So I understand this. I think that the ghetto solution, it's not just self-defeating in the long run, but it's not Catholic. It is not Catholic. So I know some of them, both student age and their teachers. It seems to me that they have very little or no commerce in terms of exchange with the world. So they live in their own little world. So I understand the need to be radical, which means to go to the roots of your faith. But if you build it in a kind of Catholic Disney world, it's good for you, for your kids, and for your colleagues. I don't think it has a future. And I don't think, also, I mean, theologically, that it provides any solution to the real issues that we have that are transversal, that are bipartisan issues. So I know some of them. And I don't see, frankly, them as creative. I just see them as extremely afraid of modernity for them and their kids, and they regroup in small places, in small things, I think, and this is possible because in America, geography allows that. That's also part of the geography of this country. So you isolate yourself in Minnesota, and it's fine. I don't believe that it is creative, that it is working.
Well, there's several things going on too. There's a tension in Catholicism. There is, you see in the early church, Christianity is an urban thing, kind of confronting the Roman Empire right where it is. But then there's also the retreat to the monastery. So there is a sense of going back. And in America, there has been a tradition as long as our country of intentional communities, that not just Catholic ones. The idea to hunker down, to regrow. I think that is wrong in the aggregate, in the sense of it cannot be a strategy for everyone, right? But I don't know if a Catholic Disney World exists. I mean, most of even these hard-bitten traditionalists have 4 televisions in their home telling them what the world is thinking, and not just what the world thinks about itself, but what it thinks of them too. I don't know if there really is a place to hide and be totally sheltered. As for
and especially for your kids to be.
Right. I mean, I wasn't. I grew up in a home that was mostly secular. I mean, I came to the faith, back to the faith in college after going to Bard College, and being at Bard College, you might know what that might be like. As for, I want to make one little sectarian point about the Latin. The case for Latin in the church was better in 1965 than it was in 1295. No one goes to a Latin Mass now without having a hand missal with the Latin and the English right next to each other. You can go and you don't learn to say now et cum spiritu tuo or the creed in Latin without understanding what it is. So I think, if anything, they should have done the vernacular in the Middle Ages and switched to Latin at Second Vatican Council.
Well, and I must say that I agree with you about the way in which the Vatican reforms were implemented. For example, Reform Jews learn Hebrew. Liberal Jews learn Hebrew. The business of sort of all Latin, clunk, no Latin, I thought was just nuts. In a lot of respects.
It was also just profoundly unsettling. Mm-hmm. You know, when you talk to people that they were taught to respect all these physical elements that were part of their worship, and then literally priests are telling architects, take out this altar rail and this altar. And the architect, non-Catholic, says, I won't do it. This is priceless work. You can't get this done. And the priest says, burn it. I would suggest that is a religious impulse against those objects. They were seen, perhaps with some reason, as obstacles to true engagement with the faith.
Yes, yes.
Sometimes they can act as that. I mean, obviously, the priest in the temple itself, in the Old Testament, could be an obstacle to God.
The pastor, I think that some of it also was pre-Vatican II authoritarianism.
Oh, yeah.
The pastor in my church got up and said, they say we have to sing, so we have to sing. Now, it wasn't real inspiring, but it was just the way they ordered you to do things before, only it was something different. And so...
You know why it happened that way? Because they were afraid that doing things slowly, that somebody, the Pope dying, something, the whole genius could be put back into the bottle. And so they rushed things because they didn't know how long this window of opportunity was going to.
It's a good question, as a matter of fact.
Absolutely. So it was done in an authoritarian way. Maybe yes, but to reform things, sometimes you need action. You need leaders.
It was complex.
But for some people, I mean, it was devastating. I mean, one of the funniest post-Vatican II stories I can think of, there's a church in Ridgefield, Connecticut, not far from where I go to church now, St. Mary's. You know, Americans would know Ridgefield, Connecticut as sort of like the set of the ice storm or something like that. We're talking one of the richest counties in one of the richest states of the country. After Vatican II, they hung up banners of Mao in the sanctuary in Ridgefield, Connecticut. in a kind of cartoonish caricature of how radical Catholicism could be. Now, of course, Ridgefield, Connecticut was not turned into a collective farm after this display, but there were such excesses that Ridgefield, Connecticut also became the site of the seminary of the Society of St. Pius X, this group of clumsy European reactionaries who claimed to hold the banner for traditionalists.
Well, anecdotes,
Yeah.
in my own country, Italy, in the Middle Ages, when things were much messier than we think, a few groups of Catholics, they would celebrate the Eucharist not with the round, but with one tortellini. I'm not kidding.
Yeah.
That's history. So the abuses in liturgical history have always been part of it.
It's true.
Always been
Absolutely.
part. In an age of reform, you see more of them. But I know these stories from 64, 65, 66. I mean, people celebrating with a beer and pot, this kind of thing. But this happened in a limited amount of time. So in these last 40 years, it's my strong conviction that the liturgical reform is the most successful reform in modern Catholicism in these last 4 centuries. Now, if you want to take out of Catholicism the liturgical reform, if you want to be consistent, you have to go back to the 1570 Mass when you were praying for the pro perfidis Judaeis,
Yes.
for these Jews who are going to hell. So,
Yes.
Well,
It-
but does
it-
anyone in the Orthodox Church, where they say St. Basil's liturgy, do you consider? I've gone to St. Basil's liturgy and
but
Melchite
we are
Rite
not
in
the Orthodox
Ukrainian.
Church. We are not an ethnic church.
Oh,
we
no.
are a universal
Oh,
church.
no,
It is different.
I agree with that, but that
We have
line,
a different claim on the world than Orthodox. And I have Orthodox friends. But Catholicism has a much higher responsibility in face of the world. We cannot keep us at the same standards of other churches, and this is one of the things that I think is great of Catholicism. Catholicism is a high responsibility in front of history, for Jews especially, and of the world. So I think that if we wanted to take out Vatican II and the Vatican liturgy, there are many consequences that we usually don't consider. And one is religious freedom, another is democracy or fascism. Before Vatican II, it was an obvious answer: fascism. Fascism is much better for Catholicism, and all these things. So I understand this. So I took Latin and Greek 5 years, so I love Latin. But I think that being Catholic is more than being attached to a museum kind of church. that's
Okay,
my
okay,
impression.
all right. Take a breath. You.
We've heard some of the debates here about the social justice, social gospel issues, to what degree it maybe needs to be reanimated here in the United States, and what ways it makes Catholicism here countercultural. This, I think, plays out in Europe as well. Famously, Joseph Ratzinger, as cardinal, had this long dialogue with Jürgen Habermas. I think Ratzinger, in many ways, reaching out towards a larger European project, and Habermas, for his part, reaching out to Ratzinger as some sort of maybe moral foundation to keep capitalism at bay from undermining his beloved technocratic EU project. But in this effort to promote social justice, the social gospel, to keep a rapacious capitalism at bay, there's been another crisis that's, and Thea mentioned a little bit, but we haven't really heard much of it so far, and that is the Vatican Bank. 1982, Roberto Calvi, very strange death, Blackfriars Bridge in London. And this is the first time it came to public awareness that there was money laundering going on in some aspect of the Vatican Bank. Recently, the EU has declined, various European oversight groups have declined to certify the Vatican Bank. It's been an ongoing project. Deutsche Bank cut off the credit card famously for the Vatican gift shop temporarily. what resources does the church have to draw upon to confront this financial crisis when it's so much inside? What are the, I mean, there's a sort, maybe perhaps you could also speak to the politics, what's going on, because I hear things about the Knights of Malta fighting for it, and it's a factionalism that, you know, those outside the church don't have any insight over. So if you could speak to it, if you could speak to this as the crisis, you know, both the politics within the Vatican Bank and then what this means for the larger social gospel.
I mean, my impression from talking to people at the Vatican in other departments like CDW or the Congregation for Doctrine of the Faith, I mean, it is just common belief or common knowledge that the Vatican Bank exists to launder money for the mob, and perhaps for Italian politicians as well. And that is why when Benedict installed a man known for reforming banks, for bringing them to international standards, his own Secretary of State, Cardinal Bertone, undermined him and made sure he was sent very quickly away to America, which is great for America but horrible for the Vatican Bank. I don't know if someone maybe would want to raise the question whether the Vatican should have a bank, I mean, at all. There can be a case made for it in that there are so many international religious groups and orders that need to move money, you know, to the third world, or there are real difficulties in managing money for planetary-sized religious orders, and the Vatican Bank is supposed to solve that. But it seemed that Cardinal Bertone wanted to be the one at the Vatican to handle anything that had interface with Italian politics.
In a disastrous way.
Right, in a totally disastrous way. I mean, some people suspect this is one of the reasons Pope Benedict resigned, was that, you know, the undermining was so close. I mean, lots of churchmen wanted to get rid of Bertone as Secretary of State, and Ratzinger refused because he thought Bertone was the only one competent to do the work.
I don't know much about the IOR, the Vatican Bank. One anecdote is that inside the Vatican, the ATMs, they have instructions in Latin. So that I have a picture of that. So no, the Vatican Bank has been a source of scandals since the late 19th century, Banca Romana, and so on. So it's an ongoing thing. What is different today is that we know that it is a matter of public accountability. So that is the big difference. One thing that Pope Francis has said many times is that he doesn't think that Peter had a bank. He doesn't think that it is essential for the ministry of the papacy to have a bank. So, to my understanding, he's moving slowly to make things more transparent. And it is news of today or of yesterday that they will create a website with informations about the Vatican Bank. Balance sheet, I mean, what they can disclose. But he is working toward transparency now. And in this, he seems to be much more radical than Ratzinger, whose public theology and whose statements on the world money were very radical, but in terms of management, he appointed, one of the appointees of Pope Benedict to chair the Vatican Bank was this German prince known for his good connection with the Frankfurt stock market. I mean, it was a bit inconsistent, let's say. So with Pope Francis, it seems that he's moving in a cautious way, but it seems that will be one of his targets of his administration. Nothing big will change until it doesn't appoint a new Secretary of State. I mean, Secretary of State is functionally in the Vatican, and in the Catholic Church, the Prime Minister. But if you are elected Pope in March, you cannot fire the Cardinal Secretary of State overnight. Mm-hmm. You have to at least give the impression that you like him a little. and you get rid of him after 6 months. So, but this is the next big step that we are waiting for.
I mean, Pope Francis is wrong about Peter not having a bank. I mean, the apostles had Judas handling the bag of money, and so the church, again, is kind of stuck in the same New Testament it's always been. The Vatican will never be good with money. I mean, the only thing the Vatican has been pretty good at in recent centuries is one of the things it's most criticized for, which is hoarding all of these priceless works of art and holding them in trusteeship and not actually putting them out as market commodities to be bought up and hidden in the houses of hedge funders. That's actually one thing I think the church has been good at, is taking care of that patrimony in those museums.
Sorry, go ahead. No.
Lillian.
I just wanted to make a comment regarding closing in as Catholics. You know, a lot of the Catholic liberals that you're saying eventually are going to die, you know, the elders. We lived in that kind of Catholic world where parish life, the parish was really the center. It was actually very European. The parish was the center of the community. And so everything, you know, even when your social engagement, what parish do you belong to? And there was CYO, there was something called the Summer School of Catholic Action. So, you know, we elders lived a very Catholic life and have become the Catholic liberals. So what the possibility may be when you guys close ranks and kind of get a taste of real life, real social life, you all might be us.
Maybe.
I mean, that's what I said.
It's perfectly possible that there is this kind of generational push and pull. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously I was born after Vatican II. I was born in 1982. So I was exposed to this world of Catholicism that was post-council. And what I was given and taught was not much at all. And my response as a younger man, I'm still kind of a young man, was to be an atheist, to go to a liberal school, you know, one of the most liberal schools with a Alger Hiss professor of social science. But we decide, you know, the people that end up in this traditionalist camp, they have a ghetto mentality that is difficult to get over and bad, but they are looking for a church that is a place of refuge from the world, you know, where their culture is commoditized. Here's a place that is not, everything is not for sale, including you. I mean, I think that's one of the things that called out to me. But also just, you know, one of the writers in Commonweal often said that the push and pull between liberal and traditionalist Catholics is, the liberal says, is the gospel being heard? You know, is it reaching people? Is it reaching out? And then after they've had their say, the conservative said, well, is the gospel being heard? You know, are we teaching something that's true, that's moving, that's worth believing in?
It's the same sentence.
Well, that's exactly right. With
emphasis on a different word.
With an emphasis on a different word. I think the polarization of the church on the ground level is exaggerated, but at the intellectual level, of journalists, of lay theologians, apologists, and bishops, it's more polarized than ever.
And this is one of the legacies of Pope Benedict. So this polarization was there already, but the temperature is much higher now because of his attempt and his leniency, his benevolence towards the traditionalist side. Yeah. So this act that I consider the most disruptive, that was the motu proprio of 2007 on the liturgy, I think that was not just illegal, was not just was not just bad, but it has produced a much more visible polarization that was much less visible with John Paul. So John Paul had a polarizing effect, but not as Pope Benedict did. So I think that this is part of his legacy. This is my opinion.
So now
of
you have
course.
to tell us why it's illegal.
Well, because he has created in Catholicism a thing that never was there before, a bi-ritual Roman Latin Catholic Church. So you have multiple liturgical rites in the Catholic Church, but they are not competing one with the other. So you have the Coptic Maronite and so on, but what you have now is you have two different liturgical rites, and it's not clear if he had the authority to override what Vatican II said. But what has happened is that these people going either to the Vatican II Mass or to the pre-Vatican II Mass, they see each other as incompatible. That is
So
new.
it's divisive.
It's divisive. It's, so that's new. That's a fact. So that's my opinion, of course. I wrote this book. That's my thesis. But I think that it is undeniable that the polarizing effect of Benedict. I've no doubt about that, actually.
Okay, I want to raise a question which kind of goes back to my what is there anything good going on, which is how those of us who care about the Catholic Church and who are not just scholars of it, and being a scholar is important, let me not suggest that it isn't, but those of us for whom Catholicism matters in some sense, like what needs to happen for things to get better. Now, I was very struck, Michael, by you saying that we needed more holy priests. And I wouldn't disagree with that. I mean, when I think about my own being led into the kind of Catholicism that I've lived, a major factor were the Catholic sisters who educated me, in particular the sisters in my high school, the Sisters of Notre Dame de Namur, who were the first educated people I had ever met. God bless the nuns in my grade school, but educated was not the primary characteristic that you would apply to them. So I suddenly met these women who had been to college, were devout Catholics, but were also smart and like had me read Gerard Manley Hopkins and things like that, you know. And of course, they hardly exist now for a variety of reasons. I mean, you said, well, they've declined, but one of the reasons they've declined is educated women, by and large, are not going to sign up to get beat up. You know, I almost say anybody who wants to be a nun today, excuse me for saying this, should be rejected on those grounds because it's like signing up for domestic abuse or something, do you know? So the question is, like in the case of holy priests, I read somewhere, why is the number of priests declining? And one older priest said, because nobody ever asks anybody to become a priest anymore.
That's part of it, yeah.
And that partly, there hardly are priests in large parts of this country, so how's anybody going to suggest it? And similarly, if educated Catholic women are the people who can lead young Catholics into becoming better educated Catholics, but the smarter a Catholic woman is, the more trouble she has with the Catholic Church, or the more highly educated she is in many cases. What do? I mean, to call people to be holy, and I would add educated priests. We just don't want holy dumb priests. But there's hardly anybody to invite them to do it because of the decline. You know, like how are we going to get people to really care about these things and do them well, not just do them?
Well, I mean, I think announcing, you know, I'm going to sound like a preacher in a sense, to preach the gospel. No one will want to be a priest or a nun if the church is just another, you know, NGO or, you know, education organization. Like I said, you can wish for the defeat of your political enemies and have little social events without the church. The church is not necessary for that. So unless the stakes for people are salvation, are the redemption of the whole world, including not just themselves, but also the social order, why be holy at all? I mean, it is an obstacle to what the rest of the culture preaches, which is self-actualization, self-discovery. That's self-actualization, self-discovery are appealing messages compared to being a religious functionary, compared to just dispensing sacraments and managing a parish because it happens to be a social institution that's near you. So the call has to reach deeper. So if you want to counterpose self-realization, self-actualization, the pursuit of ambitious projects in a market economy, just say, is this about getting to heaven and hell? Is this about saving souls? Is this about loving the poor, serving others? It has to be. I think that's the fulcrum the church can grab onto.
But is there really this binary between self-actualization and holiness? I mean, here we are, the three of us, lecturing to a huge audience. Yes, goodbye. You know, we don't seem to think that getting highly educated and holding forth to people and having conversations is not holy.
No,
you know?
I mean, there's a duty to be knowledgeable, I think.
Yeah, well, and even more than knowledgeable in some cases. But so, are we going to have, like, just holiness? I mean, excuse me, I know you think it's the most important thing in the world, but I don't think it's the most important thing in the world unless it's going to be utilized, for instance, to transform the world. Holiness in and of itself is not of great interest to me. But holiness for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the kingdom, now that's another matter. And so are we going to have that? Or, you know, like my perception of priests, young priests in, admittedly, Brooklyn and New York and Berkeley, is they're not very smart. I mean, no, by and large, they're getting dumber and dumber. I once knew some priests that weren't half stupid, but they're very old now.
No, I agree that younger priests tend to be mediocre. I think they get bad training in seminary, and I think that's been true for a long time.
Yeah.
I mean, the great modernist theologians that I was raging against 2 hours ago had unbelievable training. Yes. I mean, the Rahners, the Skillebecks, even the Kungs had wonderful.
You call them modernists.
Training. Yeah.
You call them modern.
Some of them. I mean, it's a complicated.
It's a bit reductionist, but we'll let you get.
Yes, it is. No, it is. I mean, there's the modernism of 1910.
Yeah, I thought you were going to be talking about a whole other crew when you said modernist theologians.
But they had great training. After one of the bad things after the Second Vatican Council, for whatever reason, the training of priests was not as good. The recruitment was terrible. As I said, between 1965 and 2002, you had a 90% decline in enrollment in seminaries. That kind of decline means also you cannot be very selective about who actually becomes a priest. And in fact, you become desperate.
Several of us were talking, the journalist guy and I were talking about the fact that we think a major aspect even of the sex abuse crisis is not so much, not caring, as there's such a shortage of priests that they hesitate till the last possible moment to take somebody out of the job slot.
There is this also false sense of mercy that clerics extend to each other.
Well, and also ignorance. I mean, in the 80s, people really did believe you could get cured. The psychologists believed that people could be cured.
Well, not only that, but they talk about exactly what you're talking about, which is in Rome, in the Roman Rota and other courts, they talk about, well, let's try to protect this man's priesthood in some way. Protect it from...
Well, and to go back to the American culture thing, I do think that the history of anti-Catholicism in this country still plays a certain role, especially among the bishops. Do you know that? I mean, in the 19th century, Catholics were identified with sexual deviance. I mean, one of the most popular, widely sold books in the United States was about this woman being locked away, Maria Monk, in a monastery, a convent, and being raped by priests. I mean, a lot of people still think that. I mean, I think there's more of a... So that at least in the minds of some people, it's like you really don't want any of this to get out.
And the Mormon Church has had the same problem in this country, almost the exact same problem, where in the 19th century they were considered sexual deviants.
Well, they were polygamists.
Right, no, they were...
not deviants, but certainly, like, the Catholic priests were not mostly raping the nuns.
Right, but they were polygamists, although you could, a Mormon apologist in the 19th century would say, we don't have widows begging in the street. Older women are taken care of in our colony, etc. Yeah. When the first polygamist was elected to U.S. Congress, a scroll was submitted with 2 million signatures asking that he not be seated in 1898. Now, Mormons and Catholics have gone from representing sexual anarchy and license to representing...
trying to keep gays out of the Boy Scouts.
Well, to representing, a defense of, mid-century 1950s style idealization of the suburban home.
Yeah, yeah. But let me just say that the degree of sexualization of the Catholic Church in the 19th century was off the charts, and that I do think it feeds in a little bit to the phobia about admitting things.
Are you suggesting? Sorry, is that analogy? Are you suggesting that that is a continuing anti-Catholicism and a continuing non-Catholic sexualization of the Catholic Church, or is that it's a paranoia on behalf of bishops and priests that believe that Protestants think this?
Some of the tropes of sexualized Catholicism in the United States continue. For instance, there have been a number of films, funny films about nuns where they were prostitutes. This is not just, somebody just didn't just dream that up. You know, I'm not saying that every bishop is thinking, oh, people still think nuns are prostitutes, but I do think that those aspects of culture don't go away as readily as people might think, and that I can't help but think that part of the phobia about admitting it is just this fear that people will once again, I mean, I think a certain number of Protestants in the United States always thought that celibates must be getting it somewhere.
Yeah, and there's part of this is just ongoing, you know, sometimes Catholics look at the tradition of American anti-Catholicism and they see just a straight line, a connected whole. I actually think this can be a mistake. I mean, obviously there's historical holdover, but one of the reasons anti-Catholicism of 19th century Protestants might have similar rhetoric to a more secular or atheistic anti-Catholicism presently is because the Catholic Church has some of the same characteristics now that it had in the 19th century. It's hierarchical, it's big, it seems foreign, it seems strange in its preoccupation with sexuality or chastity. So there's going to be continuing themes, but bishops themselves, and partly for the reason Massimo suggested, because they are criticized from every angle, I think often accept an extremely defensive crouch when these things come up, and they end up empowering people who are ideological charlatans. Like I would say Donahue, the Catholic League, is kind of an opportunistic ideological charlatan who trades on this increasing the anxiety and fear of Catholics that they're somehow hated in America. I mean, Catholicism will always be surrounded by what G.K. Chesterton called the halo of hatred because of its outrageous claims.
At least in Protestant countries.
Well, in almost anywhere.
In Italy?
Well, it's the largest global religion that is organized. So it is socially and it is politically a difficult customer. So I
was stupefied by the coverage of the election of the Pope. I mean, somebody finally said to me, it's like the British monarchy. They've got Prince Harry this week, but still, I was like, who could believe that something that is in some respects so archaic would be in the news like nonstop for a week or something?
Well, Rome is still a great theater of the sacred in the Western world.
And a nice place for reporters hanging out.
Yes.
Right, much better than some other places.
Yes.
No, it retains magic, unlike our elections in the United States, where the outcome is usually known or suspected well in advance.
Yeah.
I mean, the election of a pope really is this kind of strange event. It involves secrecy, which the democratic process doesn't have. In fact, modern liberal democratic societies often don't even see a need, what any legitimate use of secrecy there might be. And of course, the Vatican ultimately doesn't see the value in it either, because everyone publishes their memoirs after.
Well,
the
not
election.
everyone.
Not everyone.
There's penalty of excommunication still. So if you do that.
Well, their diaries are almost always found after they die.
Yeah, but after 20, 30 years. So
they're still keeping some archival material secret about the Holocaust, aren't they?
No,
Is that
those
finally
have
settled?
been open to everybody since 1965.
Oh, listen,
I
have a Catholic Jewish studies scholar friend that's still enraged, Eva Fleischner, over stuff that's being hidden.
Because they think that in the archives of Pope Pius XII, there's something on the Holocaust that hasn't been put in the archive of the Holocaust, and that's possible. I don't know if it's really likely. I mean,
Okay,
that's
Oh well. Anyhow, to go back to the question of how we get these people, and I would like to expand it from priests, of course, but how we get people educated.
Can I tell an anecdote about so this is as anecdotal as it gets. A dear friend of mine from graduate school, history, who was someone who, as a high school student, dreamed of being a priest, went to BC with the intention of being a priest, would in fact be a tremendous priest, a tremendous Jesuit, and went there, and he saw what it was like to be a 60-year-old retired priest. And he said, this isn't the life I want. He said, I want a family. I don't want to end up living my life alone, drunk, with a bunch of old men. And that, I mean, right? The same thing you said about anyone who wants to be a nun should be ruled out on the basis that she wants to be a nun. The same thing can be said about being a priest, and that seems to be the fundamental block of what. Yes, that means some acceding to some amount of self-actualization. But if what you want is good people to become priests, that seems like a small accommodation to make.
The Catholic Church took part in the emergence of the individual. It was not something that the secular world forced on it. I mean, when you see all those portraits from the Renaissance, they were funded by the Catholic Church, a lot of them. And similarly, Foucault says that individual confession was a source of the emergence of the individual. That you actually had somebody talking to you and listening to you meant that you were different than when that sort of thing wasn't going on. So I don't think we can rule out the individual as part of the contemporary world. A more fractured individual than maybe you were willing to admit, but nonetheless.
If I can say something.
Yes.
You're right. I considered myself 10 years ago to become a monk. And in the end, I said, well, I'm going to be isolated. But if you want, this is one of the effects of the Americanization of Catholic culture, which, in my view, is about self-fulfilling. I mean, fulfilling your potential, being happy. Life is not always about being happy.
But Massimo, what's the rate of people going into the order?
Sorry. Life
orders in
is not a rosy picture. So you can end up lonely and drunk if you're a priest, if you're a monk, if you're a layperson, if you're a nun. So I think that in some cases we put too much pressure on the Catholic Church in not solving problems that are universal. And so there are things that we all share, Catholics, Catholic priests, non-Catholic priests, but there is an element of search of happiness, of search of individual happiness, that is incompatible not just with the Catholic Church, but with religion sometimes. That's my view. That's my view.
I want to know, so are there a lot of Europeans that are becoming priests and nuns? Are there a lot of Europeans becoming priests and nuns?
No, very few.
So some individuals...
No, I mean, Americanization is a world thing now.
Okay, well, all right. I mean, so that's another matter.
It's not, I mean, it's this promise of having goods, of having freedom, and I'm happy with that. I came from Europe to the West, so I'm not blaming that. But culturally, that is a reshape. So if you watch this movie by Robert Doisneau on this poor French priest, the Journal of a Country
priest.
So you see exactly the opposite of the American dream, exactly the opposite.
Uh-huh.
And this is what religion is about. It's about teaching you that what ultimately matters is not your happiness here, it's your salvation. And so there are things that will never be solved by any structural reform of the Catholic Church. And I feel comforted by that, actually. I am reluctant to impose on the Catholic Church something that would magically make us all happy. I think it's totalitarian.
I mean, at least in America, most marriages end up in some form of unhappiness. I mean, and they are supposedly given on the same basis of until death that the priesthood is. And in fact, the the thing that attracted me to the priesthood, which I did not go into, I looked into a Franciscan friary in Scranton, Pennsylvania. There were 3 friars in it. It was traditional mass and all that. It was located in a former crack house on the edge of Scranton, and they showed me the cell, and there were still like roaches, both living roaches and then roaches for
previous life.
What? Marijuana. Yeah, marijuana roaches in the cell, that hadn't been like dug out of the crumbling walls. And when I saw the cell, that was the point at which I felt most strongly attracted to going into the priesthood, because it to me, it was that radical call to get out of, thinking about how I'm going to make my next payment on a Subaru or a mortgage, or
they worry a lot about that stuff.
Or
a lot of orders.
Or express myself through how I arranged with the furniture in my living room, and all the things that people wanted to escape in the opening scenes of Fight Club or a movie like that, like just the overweening standards of American consumerism, familyism, suburbanism. I agree with you on that.
On the other hand, for instance, religious orders, I think in general, are doing better than diocesan setups. Like the Dominicans have seen an improvement. I think the Jesuits are kind of a bad case, because I think there's a certain amount of individualism in the Jesuits that are not, for instance, in the Dominicans. So maybe people are less concerned about, being old and drunk if they're a Dominican. I don't know. But I also want to talk about the lay apostolate. I mean, it's 50 years since the Vatican Council, and how we can get lay people to be committed Catholics is an issue for me, too. I mean, some are, but, it's not just the priesthood and the religious life, for God's sake.
Yeah.
Yes?
My first comment is to respond to your experience looking at the friary. I think we're making a real mistake to conflate attraction to religion, which is a withdrawal from the world, with an attraction to priesthood, which is a ministry to the world, in the world. There is a fundamental wide distinction between those two vocations. When the very term to go into religion meant in its earliest use to leave the world and enter these communities of monks and nuns.
Since the 19th century, there certainly have been active congregations too.
It's still different. The vocation is different. And now I'm having your problem forgetting the point. But a thought that has been going through my mind as this discussion goes on is, in a way, Gary Wills, with his book, Why Priests, seems to be onto something. Yeah, there's a certain elitist, almost an elitist quality in this discussion that we're having, that we somehow think holiness is going to be found in the Roman Church. And it seems to me we almost have to let go of the idea that the true church subsists in the Roman Church. The true church is Christianity in all its manifestations, and very much in my mind is attending Eucharist liturgy in the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in Lalibela, which is an anti-Chalcedonian tradition, no less. And you see real holiness in the devotion to the reception of the Eucharist. The way we've bound ourselves into being carriers of this exclusiveness of the Roman Church, I think almost throws up an obstacle to finding any solution to the problem that this conference is about.
I don't think you should assume that. I think it's because the topic is Roman Catholicism. I'm married to an American Baptist minister. I tell people all the time I'm Baptist by marriage. So trust me, I don't think the Catholic Church is the only way you can find salvation. But that's what we're here to talk about, is the Catholic Church. I mean,
I just think that Catholic Orthodoxy has always admitted, in a sense, this this dual nature. You know, Augustine would say the church has some that God does not have, and God has some that the church does not have. But that was in no way, for him, going to legitimate Arianism as a theological school that should just be respected because who knows where the Spirit leads us, you know. That doesn't mean that we say that every Arian, every Presbyterian goes to hell.
Every liberal Catholic.
For not following Boniface VIII's Unum Sanctum, you know, for salvation every creature must be subject to the Roman Pontiff. Now, I think, you know, maybe I'm the modernist. I think you can believe Unum Sanctum and still believe that with Augustine that the church has some that God does not have and God has some that the church doesn't have. But that it's one of those contradictions of being a church in the world. But you're right that we can sound like we're binding the Spirit within four walls, but the church, and I'll speak in defense of the church, Christ founded a church precisely to carry out this ongoing mission of going out to humanity to announce salvation, to announce liberation for man. So the church is still essential, but you're right that it shouldn't tip over to exclusivity.
Well,
there is a question.
We're just about out of time, I'm afraid, because we've got to finish up early for the next event that's in here. I'll just ask a question anyway, take advantage of my position. For a start, just a quick comment. I am really surprised that women haven't come up in a range of issues, either earlier in the presentations and also throughout the discussion. It feels like, I mean, maybe I've got a particular antennae for certain things, but I feel like it's a much bigger issue than this discussion has perhaps reflected. I just see a lot of these things, and maybe I always have or something. Maybe that's my bias. And that fits into my to another question I had about the way history has been drawn upon here, because we've heard a lot about historical examples, either when the church was better or worse in some way. Talks about Vatican II so much, obviously central for a range of your opinions on your own faiths, and so you clearly, Michael, want to get back to some time before then. In some certain ways it's been a crisis or a catastrophe. And I was thinking that there's been a lack of discussion about other historical forces when we talk about the history of the church, like the history of the theology, the documents, the conferences, all of those sorts of things. Nobody's really picked up on the equivalent social history. We can't go back. There have been social revolutions. We've had the civil rights revolution and the feminist revolution and the sexual revolution and all the rest of it. We've had the 1980s hyper-capitalism, individualism that has come up. And I'm not sure that we can really come to any conclusions about reform or future without situating now historically, because the products of all the things you've been talking about and all the examples of the French Revolution, as well as Catholic examples, they've happened in a historical context that keeps changing. We're in an entirely different time to the 60s. So to me, it just seems as though a lot of these discussions have been a little bit abstract and therefore can't really tie into the actual situation that, I mean, women are certainly in now. We're in a different situation. We've had an entirely different education. My education, different to my mother's. You know, she left the Catholic Church for a variety of reasons since the 60s. So I don't know if that's a question.
I'll be very quick. So women's issue was in my list in the open issues. I mean, Vatican II didn't talk about that, but it is an issue there. Historians and theologians know very well that the Catholic Church is, as we say, is always one revolution late. So at Vatican II, the revolution they had to catch up with was the democratic revolution,
Yes.
democracy. Our problem today is that we are late facing the sexual revolution and the gender rules. We are late in that. The Catholic Church always has a problem in understanding, should we accept this or not? So in these last 2 centuries, slowly they have accepted first the religious freedom, human rights, quite late. It's open for debate now how they are going to accept theologically the sexual revolution, the women's revolution, but socially Catholics have already accepted that to a large extent. But the official teaching is distinct from what Catholics saw. The vast majority of Catholics do not agree with the official teaching. So they are part of the social movements. You are absolutely right. But there's also this gap. I mean,
I think also that one statistic about 90, however many % it was, about women using contraception. Women use contraception because they're having sex with men. I don't know why this statistic is being put in terms of women. Couples are using contraception. So even the framing of this debate I found really strange.
Yeah, I mean, I actually, that was something I criticized a lot during the debates about the contraception mandate, was that it was placed entirely as a women's issue. I would say the church has always faced revolutions and has not always recovered from them at all. I mean, one could argue that the revolution of nationalism or the divine right of kings, that the church lost something there and has never quite figured out how to deal with nationalism itself.
Yeah, a friend of mine said with regard to Vatican II, we Catholics were fighting our way into the modern world just as everyone else was leaving.
Well, and that's partly true too. I mean, I take a different. I mean, obviously, I'm a more traditionalist view. I mean, my family that I'm forming now is more traditionalist on some of these questions. I actually think Humanae Vitae speaks to the sexual revolution in some important ways. You know, that it was accurate that sexual liberation and contraception could lead and would lead to divisions within the family, exploitation of women in pornography, and for the use of men as just a commodity. I think that proved unbelievably prophetic, and it's unlistened to. People do not recognize that it's a problem. I guess it falls on deaf ears. I don't know what the... and I would actually take a more pessimistic view about the document on religious freedom from Vatican II. I mean, this was also a context where the church was thinking about communism, and not just democracy in 1789, but thinking about how do we guarantee some sort of liberty of conscience for Catholics behind the Iron Curtain or Christians behind the Iron Curtain.
And an American theologian wrote that document.
Sure.
Right, John Courtney Murray.
So it is the most American of all the documents of the Second Vatican Council. So
right, but I mean, there's also,
if you get rid of that, many consequences will follow.
And I'm not saying get rid of it at all. I'm just saying that we have to take it in. I don't understand. And for most Catholics, that is, you're right, these debates are too abstract. You know, how many people walked in here thinking about Dignitatis Humanae and John Courtney Murray?
Yes, but if you are a Catholic living in Indonesia, let me tell you, it is crucial for your life.
Yes.
If you live in Pakistan,
How
it
so?
is crucial.
Because of the oppression.
Because it's a guarantee that you are a faithful citizen of your country and you're not there to proselytize. So we should not think about issues, from Washington. There are things that are Catholic because they are crucial for the real life of Catholics in Asia, in Africa. So this is why Catholicism is important, because it speaks of the world. It tells you how the world works, how Catholics see the world. So I understand religious freedom for Europeans and for Americans. Communism is gone. The whole issue is gone. But if you are the 1% minority of Christians in a Muslim country or in a Buddhist country, in an Hindu country, the fact that they know that your church respects religious freedom is your lifeline there. It's your lifeline there. It's crucial. So I understand that that Vatican II is complicated. It is abstract. But life is complicated. And ideas are important to solve complicated problems. I'm not saying that the Vatican II is perfect. I think that going back is the worst possible disaster, not just for Catholics, but for the world. It would have consequences that I don't think we are able to fathom. Even.
Should we leave it there?
We do need to finish. If you've got any final comments to
I'm finished.
I'm pretty tired too, but I'll say I'll say that we don't know how the church can incorporate certain revolutions or contend with them. So I don't have an answer to how it would contend with the women's revolution that exists in one part of the world but does not fully exist in other parts of the world, or what that means. I mean, there's an element where, as I said, the church is not necessarily here to affirm people in their citizenship, in their membership in any particular culture or time or place. I mean, in fact, it's here to shake you out of it, and it is a little bit more scary and radical than that. Mm-hmm. So
I think it's probably easier for us to say that than for people in Indonesia. But
no, it is, but it also would have been hard to say. It was hard for Maximilian Kolbe to volunteer to be gassed instead of a Jew in the Holocaust. I mean, but that is the ultimate demand of the faith. I don't think actually it's controversial to say so. So it's not necessarily here to affirm you or anything like that. It can be there quite scarily to challenge you to do something superhuman.
Okay, can I say one last thing? I think that your observation about the fact that we did not talk more about women than we did, I think that fact, not your observation, but the fact that we didn't, is an exact reflection of the reality of the Catholic Church, which is it's very hard to focus on women because the bishops, the Pope, all these people are men. So I'm not surprised particularly that it was as hard as it was.
Thank you
Thank you all.
Yes.